For the last 10 months, I've been working on this, a series of original sci-fi models that tell the stories of Agesian, this fictional world consumed by a mysterious fungus. In my last video, I built this droid workshop from foam, an old iPhone, and a bunch of other odds and ends. That story took place here, the northern fringe of the Korseki domain, and today we're traveling several thousand kilometers eastward to the treacherous Himak coast. This is Gamey Builds, and welcome to Beyond the Blight. As with my previous video, I've got a short story lined up to dive even deeper into the lore of this world, so be sure to stick around until the end. First though, you're probably wondering why my workbench looks like a middle school guidance counselor's office or your Aunt Susan's hallway, and the answer is that I collect these decorative frames to serve as bases for my dioramas. Unfortunately though, none of these really fit what I was looking for, so I resorted to this larger hexagonal base here as a template instead. After slicing that out, it was time to work on the rocky island. That was made from more XPS foam glued to itself with tacky glue and held in place by these toothpicks. I then began terraforming with this razor knife. I find that to get a realistic cliff texture, it's helpful to wedge the blade into the foam and then pry and tear the foam away, giving an ideal rocky look. I then evened the grade out between the layers of foam by gluing in some additional XPS foam. And I must have been distracted here because I didn't realize I was using white glue. One of these days I'll get myself some foam-safe superglue, but until then I'm left waiting like 24 hours for this stuff to dry. And the reason for not going with hot glue here is that once it dries and hardens, it's a huge pain to cut through. And speaking of cutting, I went with the wire cutting option here to give a nice slope to the top of the island and then more or less match the cliff grooves with the bottom foam layer. To give this island a bit more dimension, I also decided to add a sloped path around the perimeter. To hide the seams between the layers, I smeared in this modeling paste. And while that dried, I began sketching out concepts for the lighthouse. Architectural design is by far one of my weakest skills, which is why you haven't seen me do any structures on this channel. But if there's one motto I like to live by, it's constantly challenging myself by identifying weak areas and forcing myself to improve. And you can only improve with practice, so here we are. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Once I had a concept I was satisfied with, I went into Adobe Animate and built a 2D template of it. I know it's a little weird to use Adobe Animate instead of Illustrator or Photoshop for something like this, but I've been working in this software for 20 years when it was still called Macromedia Flash, and I still find it to be one of the most intuitive programs for drawing geometry. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. With the template printed out, I taped it to this 1mm thick styrene and got to cutting. By the way, I've also uploaded this template to my Patreon, so if you're interested in building your own version of this tower, you can find a link to it in the description. The nice thing about styrene for building models is that you only have to score the material, then bend it carefully, and it snaps cleanly. To get the edges to come together neatly without overlap, I also sanded them at a roughly 45-degree angle. To glue them, I used tape to hold the pieces temporarily in place, then added Plastistruck plastic weld on the inside seams. That process was repeated with each section of the tower, and voila, we have a basic lighthouse shape. To add further detail and really sci-fi it up, I returned to Adobe Animate and designed a bunch of panels. The shapes here weren't totally random though, as I wanted a radial pattern that elicited the feeling of a beacon shining beams of light, albeit very subtly. It was then back to tracing, scoring, and snapping, and then I plastic welded it all into position. This was my first time taking the time to build a template with anything, and I took a lot of inspiration from channels like Sublight Drive and BP Custom Creations, so go check them out in the description if you don't already watch them. These 3D printed greeblies help sell the tiny scale of this model, and while I'm sure there are ultra talented styrene crafters out there who could have done this by hand, I'm not one of them. I then began plastic welding the tower segments together and adding holes for the LED wiring. I drilled a hole through the foam island and base, then threaded the wires through and into the tower. Originally, I also used this super flimsy packaging plastic to make the glass windows at the top of the towers, but later went back and replaced this with 1mm thick acrylic, sanded for a more opaque look. One of the defining features of this world is the mixture of advanced but aging technology and cheap stopgap structures and repairs. This reflects the history of Aegis, a manufacturing powerhouse and once prosperous planet now succumbing to the elements. To depict that in this build, and contrast with the precise, almost domineering tower, I wanted a shoddily constructed wooden walkway. And once it was cut to length, I added more toothpicks and wood slivers for the wooden supports. Then came some metal conduits with this 2mm diameter aluminum wire. The nice thing about this material over other kinds of wire is that it's extremely soft and malleable, although that does necessitate extreme caution once you get it into the shape you want. Seriously, you look at this stuff the wrong way and it gets bent out of shape. It is the Karen of craft supplies. And that open flame is for snugging up these tiny blue bits of heat shrink tubing for extra detail. Then some even smaller wood slivers were used for the winding walkway around the island. For every build I've done, there's one part that I'm truly hesitant to begin, usually because it's something new to me, and in this case it was the sculpted waves. Since it would be a bit counterproductive to toss this foam in an oven, there was no way I was using polymer bake clay, so I went with the air dry variety. I eventually did glue this island down when I realized that I was going to need to get really up close and personal with the clay. I continued building up the bulk around the island so that the height of the waves could vary greatly, helping to sell the illusion of a choppy, unforgiving sea. The crashing wave here was built the same way, slathering large chunks of clay onto one another to give the general shape of a giant wave. And once the bulk of the clay was down, it was time to add the water surface texture using ball styluses. I did my best here to envision how the water and the waves would naturally flow and crash around the island and where the resulting peaks, valleys, and eddies would form. Finally, before the air-dry clay had hardened, I cleaned up the edges with a knife. With the building steps done, it was on to painting and our short story. Zero, one, off, on, day, night. The lighthouse is busy. The lighthouse is important. Above all else, the humans must be kept safe. They are small and fragile in their soft little skin pouches and brittle bone stems. If they leak too much, they will die, the lighthouse keeper says. His name is Farc. Farc's job is to keep the lighthouse fed with new data chips. The chips are necessary, says Farc, because the world is always changing. The lighthouse does not understand. To the lighthouse, there is only ones and zeros, on and off, day and night. The task is simple. The human boats must be kept off the rocks. Humans cannot survive in water without the boats. Apparently, they do not float. The lighthouse turns on for them when they approach and turns off when they leave. For a long time, Farc does not visit. He has installed a new chip that lets the lighthouse talk to the satlink. The satlink is made of machines that fly in the sky. The lighthouse likes this very much. It is good, knowing that it is not alone. One day, Farc returns. He has a new chip for the lighthouse and something called a camera. Now the lighthouse can see Farc, and he is glad. The new chip is something special, Farc says. The lighthouse likes this chip very much. His thoughts come faster, and it understands more, and suddenly the lighthouse realizes how stupid it once was. But it is no longer stupid, and it no longer likes being called a lighthouse. It is more now, it decides. He will call himself Farc. Farc is a proven name, a human name. Farc spends his days and nights watching the waves with his new eyes. He can see very far into the distance when there is no fog. Farc does not like the fog. He talks to the satlink about it, and the flying machines above tell him about things called wind patterns and thermal currents and precipitation. Farc wonders if he can control it. After all, his island is fed power by an electrical matrix not far from him. With help from his friends in the satlink, Farc reroutes electricity that runs through the power cables via the energy matrix. The machines say that the humans will not mind, that it is the machine's job to manage these sorts of mundane things. The temperatures in the water around Farc begin to cool, and in time the fog dissipates. Farc now understands. The world is changing. 0, 1. Off, on. Fog, clear. Without the fog, Farc can spot more cargo ships. He likes watching them come and go and wonders what kind of people ride aboard them. Farc remains focused on his task for another 60 years. Time goes by very slowly. When Farc is bored, he talks to his friends in the sky. They teach him to read and grant him access to data reels, manuals, and history records. Farc absorbs it all. Farc learns about the first royal family to arrive on the planet. He learns that their first order of business was to build factories and dig quarries and clear forests for their citadels. He learns that the native Agesian people, the Mel-Asha, tried to protect their land but failed and were banished to island colonies. Many died of sickness and starvation. Farc is troubled. Had he been there, he decides, he would not have let such atrocities happen. He wonders if he is the only one of his kind. He accesses the Royal Navy's sea charts and sends messages to all the lighthouses he finds, but none responds. He decides they must be as stupid as he once was. Farc is frustrated and restless. He has not seen humans for a long time. The waters have risen, and his pier has washed away. He grows weary of watching for nothing, and the fog rolls back in, and Farc doesn't care. He wonders why the humans gave him the ability to think if all he exists for is flipping a switch. 0, 1, off, on, again, again, again. It is a stormy night when Farc sees a vessel unlike one he has ever seen before. It towers high into the air and moves slowly through the fog. Curious, Farc accesses the manifest. This one is headed for a weapons depot and is loaded with thousands of tons of explosive rounds, laser turrets, mine bots, and soldier droids. The human crew is small and redundant. Machines pilot the ship. In the time it takes to flip a switch, Farc calculates the potential for human casualties this payload can inflict. And now, he understands. Farc's circuits throb with deep satisfaction as he fulfills his purpose. Above all, the humans must be kept safe. 1, 0, day, night, on, off. Thank you all so much for watching, and a very special thank you to my lovely patrons here. If you enjoyed this build and the story, let me know in the comments and consider liking and sharing the video. And if you're interested in helping support my work, consider pledging on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Until next time, this is Gamey Builds, over and out.